People say racing is dangerous, but I'll take my chances on the track any day than on a highway. Well,
Amid a Los Angeles so loud it feels suffocating, there stands a small cabin in Sherman Oaks, the place that once served as James Dean's home. It's hard to believe that from such a modest space emerged the face that would define the spirit of 1,950 seconds. America, James Dean. Dean lived only 24 years and appeared in just 3 films, yet he created a true earthquake. All 3 became classics. He received 2 Oscar nominations after his death, and his image appeared on more than 40 magazine covers in a single year. The press celebrated him as the ultimate symbol of youth, but behind that glowing spotlight lay the things Hollywood always tried to hide. A forbidden love, secret same-sex relationships, and a feverish addiction to speed. Only after Dean passed away did that small cabin truly begin to reveal his secrets, from handwritten notes and old photographs to strange objects scattered around the living room and letters that were never sent. Piece by piece, they uncovered a James Dean entirely different from the legend the public thought they knew. James Dean was not just an actor, he was a phenomenon that forced post-war America to look back at its own younger generation. With the 3 films East of Eden, Rebel Without a Cause, and Giant, Dean turned cinema into a declaration of youth itself. The courage to defy norms, the willingness to expose loneliness, and the desperate desire to be understood. His somber eyes, his defiant posture, and his raw, unfiltered approach to acting made him stand apart completely from every star of his era. More than that, James Dean became the defining icon of 1,950 seconds youth. They copied every detail of his style, the slicked-back hair, the red jacket, the brooding walk that carried a hint of challenge. The press called him the man who taught America that emotion is also a form of strength, while Hollywood celebrated him as a symbol of instinct and freedom. On screen and in real life, James Dean remained the immortal spirit of a generation, a place where young people could live authentically, even if only for a fleeting moment. But James Dean did not rebel only on screen in real life. He was even more unrestrained. On set, Dean ignored directors' instructions, refused to stand on his marks, and often disregarded the script to follow his intuition. Some days, he would abruptly change the rhythm of his lines, confusing his co-stars so much that filming had to stop. On other days, he surrendered so completely to his emotions that, even before the camera rolled, no one dared to lay a hand on him. The entire crew became accustomed to holding their breath and waiting. Who will Jimmy snap at today? Or what prop is he going to smash this time? One colleague once said, with equal parts admiration and bewilderment, "Dean doesn't act. He lives inside every role. And that makes all of us both in awe of him and afraid of him." Off-camera, James Dean remained the same reckless soul, a heavy smoker who always had a cigarette on his lips or was searching for a lighter out of sheer instinct. He drank regularly, especially during the endless nights when he couldn't sleep. Friends recalled that Dean could sit for hours with a bottle of whiskey and a cigarette, as if that were the only way to keep himself from being swallowed by the chaos in his mind. And sometimes, when the loneliness grew too heavy, Dean would disappear into Ciro's, the legendary nightclub on the Sunset Strip, where he sat alone in a dim corner, quietly observing the noisy crowd, as if looking for something no one else could understand. And that same instinctive nature pulled Dean into a turbulent private life, where his relationships with both men and women flared up as fiercely as the man he was. The public came to know James Dean through his whirlwind romances with a wide range of Hollywood beauties. Liz Sheridan from his New York days, Alice Denham from the literary world, Terry Moore during the period when he was just beginning to rise, and Ursula Andress, the fiery blonde whose every step the tabloids chased. These relationships arrived quickly and vanished just as fast, mirroring Dean's own reckless rhythm of life, dancing in a club at night, only to disappear the next morning in his silver sports car, holding a woman backstage today, then drinking alone the next day. Yet, Among all those fleeting pleasures, Pier Angeli was the one who made Dean slow down. With her, he became less impulsive, less restless, as if the chaos in his mind had finally found a place to rest. Pier once said, "Jimmy is the loneliest person I have ever met." Dean saw her as the rare piece of peace he had never been able to hold on to in his entire life. But Pier's family fiercely opposed the relationship. They wanted her to marry a stable Catholic man, not a young actor who lived as if tomorrow might never come. And eventually, Pier was forced to marry someone else. Dean stood outside the church, a half-burnt cigarette in his hand, watching her step out in her wedding dress, before quietly turning away a moment sharp enough to tear open the part of his heart he always hid beneath that rebellious facade. But that was only the surface. Behind the lights, James Dean also had secret relationships with men. The first was William Bast, his roommate, his companion, and one of the very few who reached the deeper layers, Dean never allowed to spill outward. They lived in shabby New York apartments, sharing cheap meals, and struggling through endless days without a role. Bast later revealed that between them were moments that went far beyond friendship, nights filled with nothing but the distant sound of cars and a silence deep enough for two people to understand what neither dared to say aloud. A neighbor who lived on the same floor back then once said that whenever Dean returned from a failed audition, he never went straight to his own room. He knocked on Bast's door first. "They spoke so softly I couldn't hear a thing," the neighbor recalled. But afterward, Jimmy always seemed calmer, as if Bast was the only person who could pull him back to the ground. Another time, someone saw Dean leaning against Bast's shoulder in the hallway, so exhausted he could barely stand, while Bast simply held him without asking a single question. If Bast brought tenderness, then Rogers Brackett arrived as a darker chapter in Dean's life. A successful radio director, Brackett was the first person to open doors for Dean into the world of powerful figures. But his presence was not merely supportive. Brackett saw, beneath Dean's rebellious exterior, a vulnerable emptiness, an emptiness he could step into, and one that made Dean afraid to walk away. Yet, their attachment could exist only in the shadows, because Hollywood, in the 1,950 seconds, was a place where a single rumor of homosexuality could erase a career after just one newspaper headline. In Jimmy, The Secret Life of James Dean, author Darwin Porter describes the relationship between Dean and Brackett as something far beyond mentorship, warm, yet tangled, a source of comfort and a source of danger at the same time. When Dean began to rise to fame, the balance between them shifted sharply toward Brackett. He held the pieces of Dean's past that the young actor could never afford to let slip out. A single careless remark from Brackett could have made Warner Brothers turn their backs on him, destroying the carefully engineered image of the ideal leading man they had worked so hard to build. And Dean understood that completely. He once confessed to a friend, "I'm not afraid of being hated. I'm afraid of them knowing who I am." And the name that consumed the most ink in the press was none other than Marlon Brando. Two young stars, two rebellious souls, two gazes that seemed to carry storms within them, yet whatever existed between them never appeared beneath the stage lights. It lived in the shadows, where truth was always twisted into myth. Some said Dean was drawn to Brando with an almost obsessive fascination, not the kind of idolization fans have, but a vague, irresistible longing like a child touching fire, knowing it will burn, but wanting to feel it anyway. Dean's friends recalled how he would sit motionless for hours just to rewatch a single Brando scene from A Streetcar Named Desire, his eyes searching it for an answer to the loneliness inside himself. A studio assistant once remembered that Dean always kept a small photo of Brando in his wallet. No one knew why. They only knew Dean never let anyone ask about it. One night, according to a witness, Dean stood in silence before Brando's apartment door as if testing his courage to knock, but eventually turned away, leaving behind a dim hallway light that looked like a regret he could never quite name. These relationships were never something Dean spoke about publicly, but as witnesses gradually revealed fragments of the story, the image of James Dean grew fuller. Not the carefree legend Hollywood crafted, but a complicated, solitary young man constantly searching for someone who might understand the shadows he carried. And after all those secrets he could not voice, Dean turned to the only place that allowed him to breathe: speed. For him, the steering wheel wasn't a thrill, it was an escape. The one place where he didn't have to act, didn't have to defend himself, didn't have to fear anyone's gaze. Friends said that every time his hands touched the wheel, all his anxieties disappeared, leaving only the sound of the engine, beating like his true heartbeat. During the filming of East of Eden, Dean once shot across the studio lot in his Triumph TR5, so fast that Elia Kazan nearly stopped filming just to yell at him. Dean only laughed and dropped a line that froze the entire crew: "If I'm not going fast, I don't feel alive." When he worked on Giant, the studio issued a strict ban on him driving off set, and yet, every time the cameras stopped, he vanished along with the roar of an engine, as if running from his own loneliness. Another famous anecdote took place when Dean drove his Porsche 356 at the Palm Springs race. Although he was a newcomer, he stunned the entire track when he passed 3 veteran racers within the first few laps. Spectators described the look in Dean's eyes as brighter than the sunlight bouncing off the rearview mirror. He finished second, but all Palm Springs talked about was a single name: James Dean. Right after that success, Dean traded his Porsche 356 for a Porsche 550 Spider, a machine so dangerous that even seasoned racers treated it with caution. It was that car which later earned the nickname Little Bastard, custom painted for him by famed pinstriper Dean Jeffries. People said Dean chose that name not out of mischief, but because he saw himself reflected in the car: fast, dangerous, impossible to tame. But the very thing that made Dean feel more alive than any love was the thing that drove him straight toward death. On the morning of the 30th of September, 1955, he locked the door of his small cabin at 14611 Sutton Street. When he left, Dean wore a white shirt, old jeans, a leather jacket, and a faded red cap. At his side was Rolf Withrick, the mechanic who understood every breath of the Porsche 550 Spider. They left Los Angeles in the pale morning light, at an hour when the city had barely woken. Along the way, he met photographer Sanford Roth, who captured the final image: Dean, smiling behind the wheel, eyes narrowed in the sun, with a US 466 road sign standing behind him. No one knew the photograph would become the last witness of a legend. That afternoon, they stopped at Blackwell's Corner, the midpoint of their journey, where Dean drank apple cider and said goodbye to a few fellow travelers driving a truck. Then he continued along Highway 46. At the same moment, a 2-3-year-old student named Donald Turnipseed was driving his Ford Tudor toward the intersection of SR 46 and SR 41 near the tiny town of Cholame. When the two roads met, fate met them as well. At about 5:45 p.m., Turnipseed turned left. Dean had only enough time to choke out a single line: "That guy's coming right at us." And everything after that dissolved into the sound of breaking metal. The head-on impact crushed the front of the Spider completely. The car spun across the pavement, throwing Withrick out, while Dean was trapped inside the cockpit, motionless, dazed, unable to free himself. When officers arrived, he was still breathing faintly, as if his life were hanging by the thinnest threads. They pulled him from the twisted metal, placed him on a stretcher, and rushed him straight to Paso Robles War Memorial Hospital. But only a few minutes after he was taken into the emergency room, at 6:20 p.m., James Dean was pronounced dead. He was only 24. The investigation moved quickly. The hearing in San Luis Obispo County produced a short, simple conclusion: accidental death. No criminal fault. Turnipseed, the student who had unknowingly made that left turn at the fatal moment, was released right after his first testimony. No charges, no disputes. Everything was closed as neatly as a bureaucratic procedure. Accident experts later determined that Dean had not been speeding as newspapers claimed. His estimated speed at the moment of impact was only about 55 miles per hour, fully within the legal limit. But the Porsche 550 Spider was extremely low to the ground. The sunset light hit the road directly, and Turnip Seed's sudden left turn combined with it all, creating a moment no one could have avoided. The legal conclusion was simple, but its echoes were not. Many witnesses said the Cholame Junction had long been a blind spot due to the rolling hills, and near dusk, silver cars almost melted into the sky. Police noted the detail in their report, but no one returned to ask whether the crash could have been avoided with better warning signs. While the authorities closed their file, Hollywood opened another, a file about image. Warner Brothers immediately gathered every photo from the crash site and controlled every shred of information that escaped. They did not want the public to see Dean in his final moment, crushed between steel and helpless. They needed James Dean to die as an icon, not a traffic victim. When news of his death spread, Hollywood seemed to hold its breath. Radio stations paused their music for moments of silence. Newspapers printed the headline boldly across the front: "Rebel without a cause, dead at 24. People who had watched him on screen wept as if they had lost their own youth. In New York, lines of young people in leather jackets with slicked-back hair gathered outside a theater. Showing East of Eden once more, they said nothing, only stared at the poster as if trying to hold on to his gaze for one last second. Elizabeth Taylor couldn't attend the funeral because she was too devastated. Director George Stevens said he couldn't shoot another scene for months. In Dean's hometown of Fairmount, Indiana, locals placed flowers around his grave until the small cemetery looked like a field of white. Even people who had never met him sent telegrams of condolence to Warner Brothers. Their phone rang non-stop for days with the same question: "Is it true that James Dean is gone?" But perhaps the most heartbroken were the young people. To them, Dean wasn't just an actor. He was the embodiment of themselves. Rebellious, lonely, misunderstood. When they heard he had died, it felt as if their own chance to live truthfully had died too. In high schools across the country, hundreds of letters were written to Dean's family, filled with short, sincere lines like, "You taught us how to be ourselves." In the years that followed, youth culture exploded from rock music to fashion, and Dean's silhouette became the banner of an entire rebellious generation. The photo of him with a cigarette hanging from his lips, hands in pockets, walking through the rain in New York, became the eternal symbol of beautiful loneliness. On the walls of dorm rooms and in the bedrooms of 17-year-old boys, his poster remained not merely as an actor, but as a reminder that some souls live too fast to ever be forgotten. Decades later, every year on September 30th, people still bring flowers to the James Dean Memorial Junction, the place where he died. Vintage cars drive past, honking 3 times a quiet salute. And when the sun sets over the hills of Cholame, someone almost always murmurs, "He never disappeared. He's just driving far away." And once they left that fateful road behind, people began returning to the place he once lived, a house slowly turning desolate, just like the emptiness James Dean left behind. In the quiet neighborhood of Sherman Oaks, there once stood a modest cabin at 14611 Sutton Street. People called it the final house because it was the place where Dean woke up on the morning of the 30th of September, 1955. The cabin was nothing like what anyone imagined a Hollywood star would live in. Just a dark wooden box, a low-sloped roof, and a few small windows looking out onto a garden shaded by palms. Nico Romanos, the manager of the Villa Capri restaurant, rented the place to Dean, a simple refuge that suited his quiet way of living. Stepping inside, anyone could sense the breath of a young artist living fast. A pair of bongo drums lying in the middle of the living room, strange trinkets collected from late-night cafes, a few hurried sketches, jazz records scattered among piles of paper. The space was so simple that the old wooden chair where Dean usually sat had become the lone focal point of the entire house. After he died, friends returned to clean up and discovered several undeveloped film rolls in an old cabinet, candid images of Dean sitting by a window, rehearsing lines, and even one rare photo where he was laughing. No one knew why he had never taken them to be developed, but those pictures allowed people to see a quieter, humbler James Dean, one that felt far more intimate than the rebellious icon on screen. Neighbors who lived nearby recalled that on his final night, Dean stayed awake almost until dawn. The light from his window stretched across the narrow walkway, and every so often, the familiar rhythm of his bongo drums pulsed softly into the quiet. The next morning, he locked the door, the smell of cigarette smoke still lingering in the air. No one imagined that the door would never open again. After Dean's death, the house became a place for fans to visit, hoping to feel some piece of his real life. They left flowers on the porch, wrote his name in chalk on the wooden fence, and stood for hours at the doorway, as if, with just a bit more luck, they might see Dean's shadow walk home again. Some even swore that at times they heard the sound of an engine or the beat of bongo drums coming from inside. But in 1957, the house suddenly burned down in a fire that was never clearly explained. The flames consumed the wooden structure completely, leaving behind only the foundation and a charred remains of the fireplace. To many, it wasn't just an accident. It felt as if the house could no longer bear the weight of the memories it had held for those 2 haunting years. Today, a modern home stands on the old ground. Yet residents in the area still say the place carries a very particular silence, the kind that makes people instinctively slow down as they drive past, as if some invisible gaze is still watching from walls that no longer exist. No one can explain it, but everyone agrees that the house never truly left Dean. The Sutton Street cabin, therefore, is more than just an address. It is a fragment of Dean's personality that survived simple, solitary, and quietly escaping the glare of Hollywood. In a world built on brightness and pretense, he chose to live in a small space where he could breathe and simply be himself. But fate, as always, gave him too little time. Now, all that remains are a few old photographs. Dean, sitting on the porch steps, a cigarette in hand, the wind brushing gently through his hair. Everything is so still that you can almost hear time itself slow down. And perhaps, if there was ever a place that held the truest version of James Dean, it was the little cabin turned to ashes on Sutton Street, the place where an ordinary young man lived before his name became a legend. And the story of James Dean did not end with that cabin, it merely opened a new chapter, where his legacy began to take shape. When Dean died, he left behind an estate worth about $100,000. Not large, compared to other stars of his era, but enough to mark the beginning of a career burning at its brightest point. He never had the chance to write a will, nor did he care about copyrights or the commercial future of his image. At 24, no one imagines death arriving so soon. Then, fate delivered its cruel twist. Every asset and every spark of rising fame was transferred to his father, Winton Dean, a man almost absent throughout his son's childhood. Years earlier, after his wife's death, he had sent James away to live with relatives. Now, after that boy had become a legend, he was the one who inherited it all. A melancholy paradox where glory meets loss. After a wave of grief swept across the world, James Dean's name erupted like a flame that refused to die. His face, the leather jacket, the distant eyes, the cigarette between his lips covered America. On magazine covers, in student dormitories, across billboards. Life magazine wrote, "Death has lit an eternal flame for James Dean." Films once considered experimental were suddenly revered as cinematic legacy. East of Eden, Rebel, Without a Cause, and Giant were re-released, drawing audiences and revenues far beyond their original runs. To manage his image and the rising streams of income, the James Dean Foundation Trust was established, holding global commercial rights. Dean's face appeared everywhere on the Berlin Wall, in cafes in Tokyo, on American students' denim jackets, and in European graffiti. He became a universal manifesto of youth, rebellious, lonely, and free. By the 1982nd, the paradox returned. James Dean was earning more money dead than alive. Forbes listed him among the highest-earning deceased celebrities, as licensing profits continued to grow year after year. The Dean brand became worth tens of millions of dollars, something the young man in that small wooden cabin in Sherman Oaks could never have dreamed of. But behind that commercial brilliance lay a quiet, aching note. Those who had once been close to Dean felt pain watching his image being exploited endlessly. Playwright William Bast, who had lived with Dean, once said, "Jimmy wasn't born to be a logo. He just wanted to be understood." Another friend confided softly, "Maybe he'd be proud to be remembered forever, but he'd certainly be sad to see his face printed on soda cans." Even so, the legacy continued to spread as if Dean had never truly left the world. In the town of Fairmount, the James Dean Memorial Museum remains open every day, preserving his old shoes, unfinished manuscripts, and faded photographs. Visitors come not only to honor a movie star, but to feel that elusive current of energy, the one that makes people believe James Dean is still alive somewhere, suspended between memory and humanity's yearning. Though he lived only 24 years, James Dean left behind a blazing artistic legacy. Yet behind that brilliance were the shadows Hollywood always tried to hide: loneliness, pressure, secrets, and the things he never dared to speak aloud. He became a symbol of freedom, but also a reminder of the painful price one pays for living too honestly in a city that prefers fiction over truth. So, is trading freedom for fame ever worth it? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe for more journeys to come.